George Patton called this the greatest battle implement ever devised. Stay tuned because we're going to talk about World War II rifles. Okay, this is going to be part 3 of the beginning and the end. If you have been watching my channel, I did part 1 and part 2 where we talk about pistols that were used by the different combatants in World War II from the beginning of development of that pistol all the way to the end. The theme that we showed was that they tended to deteriorate, especially in the German army. Again, anytime you have an army who's losing the war, they're running out of materials and money, and so they're taking shortcuts. And so we see in the American stuff, not so much, but on the other weapons, we'd see them changing the sights to make them simpler, removing the stock lugs and some of the safety features. And certainly with all of them, including the United States, the cheaper finishes toward the end. Parkerized finishes, phosphated finishes, and in some cases with German pistols, no finish at all in 1945. But now it's time for part 3, and we're going to talk about the rifles that were used in World War II, mostly American and German. We're going to look a little bit at a Soviet rifle. But the difference is, I don't see a lot of deterioration in terms of development. In fact, I see improvements in rifles. So basically, if you look at the technology of pistols, other than the Belgian FN high power, that was a new development actually before World War II. And they used that magazine that was a stackable magazine, held 13 rounds. And that became industry standard after the war. Today, most of our handguns, especially used by military and police, would be stackable high-capacity magazines. But other than that pistol, there really was no new development in pistols from the beginning of the war to end of the war in terms of a technological change that would improve pistols. That is not true for the rifles. There were technological developments in rifles, and we're going to go through that actually show improvement from the beginning of the war to the end of the war. So it's the opposite of what we watched in episodes 1 and 2. Aren't you excited? So let's start with the U.S. Army. They were using the 1917-1903 Springfields, and they continued to use those. But the new development in the beginning of the war, about 1938-39, was the M1 Garand. We already know what Patton thought of it, and it was a phenomenal rifle, still is. It was used throughout World War II. But it also was unchanged in World War II. Basically, the same rifle, what you see is what you get. They did, at the very end of the war, there was a sniper version. And then into the Korean War, they also had a sniper version there. And they used them all the way through Vietnam. And after that point, they were just shipped out to other countries because we had no use for them anymore for obvious reasons. But they had a really long shelf life. The sniper versions, by the way, was the M1C and the M1D. But again, very few of them were used. For the most part, in World War II, the sniper rifle, if you know Saving Private Ryan, the sniper rifle tended to be an earlier bolt-action rifle, such as the 1903. I have an example right here. This is an example of the 1903 bolt-action rifle. You can see it's a little bit awkward, and it's even more awkward when it was shown in Saving Private Ryan because their sniper, if you remember, was left-handed, and he was actually quoting scripture and praying as he was shooting the enemy. This is, I believe, a later scope, not the one that was usually used in World War II, but this is just an example of a bolt-action rifle, was improved by the Garand, and then one other rifle which you all know and love, and that is the M1 carbine. Okay, so this is the one that I know and love. I know I look massive in video, but I'm actually of smaller stature. And so for me, carrying this around 20 miles a day, as opposed to this, with a 15-shot magazine versus an 8-shot magazine, this is very heavy. It also has a lot more firepower, 30-06. It's a very powerful weapon, shoots more accurate at longer distances. But for me, this is the rifle for me. M1 carbine, iconic. And they're really, again, it was used through World War II, Korean War, all the way to Vietnam. Again, these were shipped all over the world even after that. And you know, ironically, sometimes they're coming back to the United States, being imported back and then sold to collectors. Collectors will often then restore them back to their original condition, which is not that hard to do. But for me as a collector, I try to find one that has all original configuration, and this would be one of them. They had several makers. I think there was 5 different makers. This one is actually Inland. Inland is written right there, and actually one tip you can look for, you won't be able to see it, but the date, the month and the year is written right here. I believe this one is from 1942 or 43. Early configuration because you have high wood, and I can explain what that means. Also 2 rivets here, no bayo lug, and the flip sight. That's the original configuration for a World War II carbine, and this is the one that is most collectible and probably brings the most value. We'll do the over-the-shoulder look instead, but let's compare these two. This is an example of a reworked or later gun. Actually, it was reworked probably a couple of times. You can see that the later ones had 4 rivets instead of 2, and that just made it a little more secure. They added the bayo lug. That actually happened in 1945, so you'll see some of the very late production guns, they added that bayo lug, and then certainly through Korea and Vietnam, they would have the bayo lug. But the original configuration did not have the bayo lug. If you watch film from that era, or even well-made war movies, they will always show the no bayo lug, and the adjustable sight showed up around 1944, so most of the production had the flip sight. If the gun was reworked, like this one, and then came back and somebody wanted to put it back to original configuration, that happens a lot, and it does reduce the value. And the best way to tell is the bayo lug. If you remove it, you'll see a shadow, or you'll see marks right here where you could tell one was there and was removed. And then secondly, if you change out the sight, there will be what they call stake marks, where they took a hammer and a punch hole and hit it to remove it. So basically you look for any kind of alteration here or here, and you know that it's probably not original configuration, or it was reworked back to original configuration. But nonetheless, this is just a beautiful example of a wartime M1 carbine. They did not change very much other than improving the rear sight and adding the bayonet lug for attaching the bayonet. By the way, here's one with the bayonet attached, so it shows the overall fit. Now, one more I want to show you, just because there's no extra charge. It really doesn't have anything to do with the development of the A1, but it is a variation that collectors seek, and that is the paratrooper model. You've probably heard of the paratrooper model. You can tell it's early, no bayonet lug, flip sight, 2 holes at the top, 2 rivets at the top, and high wood. So this is a paratrooper model, and what makes it unique is it does fold. When you hit here, obviously it marks that, so I usually try to cover that. And then it would actually go into a canvas case and could be carried right along your leg. That's how the paratroopers would parachute into the landing zone, and then they were ready to go. So it is, as I said, highly sought after. This is called the cheek pad, by the way. They often will be replaced, so if they look like they're brand new, they probably are. But as I said, these are highly sought after by collectors. Okay, before I talk about the submachine guns, which are also very interesting, I have to do a quick disclaimer. There's about 10% of you out there that know way more than me about the M1 Garand and the carbines and these machine guns. I enjoy showing these to you. The vast majority of you only know these guns from Call of Duty or war movies. So I'm doing a very broad brush. There's a lot of detail that I'm not going into that I could spend 3 years and not learn everything that needs to be known about Garands and M1s, let alone the machine guns. So my disclaimer is I'm showing you a large variety of US-made rifles that your average infantry squad would be carrying with them. And again, if you watch a lot of war movies like I do, you know they always have one sniper, one guy with a machine gun, and that's for small arms fire, up close and personal, in the jungle, bonsai charge. this is the weapon you want, or a Thompson submachine gun. But there's a lot more detail that we could go into about the Garand and all the American weapons, let alone the Germans, what we're going to do next. So let's jump into machine guns. This is an example of how there were improvements made. The quality, not so much, well, the quality of the Thompson is phenomenal. I don't have one currently, but we have sold them in the past. Here's an example of a World War II era Thompson submachine gun. And as I've already alluded to, this one person in the squad would often carry a machine gun. I believe in Saving Private Ryan, it was Tom Hanks' character that carried the Thompson. And it really wasn't good at a long distance. You certainly don't use it for sniper fire, but if you're up close, you're being rushed by an overwhelming force, or you're just laying down cover fire, this or the BAR would be something that you would want to use. So the development was, first they came out with the Thompson. In fact, we exported a lot of Thompsons to the British. They used it for the police, but also for the military. And when the war started, we were using Thompsons. But what we quickly found out is we could not keep up with demand. So they were looking for a cheaper alternative. The British Sten was a stamped metal, very inexpensive machine gun, which I've never shot one, but I'm told they work really, really well. They're very reliable, extremely cheap, like less than a quarter of the cost of a Thompson. So instead of buying more Thompsons, they made the British Sten. And then the US wanted to keep up with the demand as well. And so they went from the Thompson to this, what most people call the grease gun. This one was made by Ithaca. It's a submachine gun, uses the same caliber as the Thompson, which is a .45 caliber pistol round, and an extended magazine, of course. And then the Thompson has a fixed stock. This is a wire stock that is collapsible. You push the button and you slide it in. I don't want to scratch the gun. It's not my gun. Notice how inexpensive the sights are. There's no adjustable. You know, that's why you see a lot of times they shoot from the hip. The front sight is painted, and then it works from an open bolt. Pop it back, open bolt, and then it slam fires forward. And as soon as it hits, it shoots off the round, and it'll just keep going until you let go of the trigger. So very simple, very, very inexpensive. And they made tens of thousands of these toward the end of the war. I think the earliest manufacture was 1943, and then this took the place of the Thompson submachine gun. I already mentioned the BAR. That was a 30-06, so it was a much heavier caliber. That was a bear to carry around. But usually in war movies, the biggest guy in the squadron would carry the BAR, and they could also lay down cover fire, or take out an enemy that was maybe in a building behind a brick wall, because a BAR will take out the brick wall if you just keep shooting it. Okay, let's move on to the German army. Now this is kind of paradoxical because the Germans, especially in World War II, were known for having developed some of the most technologically advanced weapons in the world. And when they started the war in 1939 by invading Poland, their mainstay military rifle was the K98. The K98 is just a newer version of the Gewehr 98, and no different, well, very, very similar to the gun that they carried in World War I. So soldiers in World War I used a bolt-action Gewehr 98. Soldiers in World War II used a K98. Few alterations to simplify it a little bit, but generally this was the rifle that the majority of the German soldiers carried. And if you look at photographs from that time period, I can still see a photograph in my head of the German army invading France with one of these rifles, and I think they're jumping over a fence. And they just, you know, they're carrying a bolt-action rifle as they're conquering Europe with this really old technology. So what was also interesting about this is we, of course, already had the Garand, and the Soviet Union, by 1940, when they were invaded, they had an SVT. I'm going to show you one. I had an SVT once, but I took penicillin and it went away. I know, that's a stale joke. Let me get you the SVT. Okay, so the Russian army, they were also using a bolt action. So the US was using bolt action, the British, the Germans, they were using a Mosin Model 9130 bolt action rifle. That's what the majority of the troops carried. But this SVT is dated 1940, so that by the time Germany invaded Russia, they already had these rifles, or they were, I don't know how many they had. These are actually pretty rare. But the bottom line is, it's a semi-automatic rifle. And the US had a semi-automatic rifle, and the Germans at that point did not have a semi-automatic rifle. Now I'm going to show you a G41. They came out with a Walther G41, which was their first attempt at a semi-automatic, but it did not do well in testing or in actual use. It was unreliable and hard to maintain. It didn't do well in dirt and mud or snow. So that design did not work out real well. But they did capture quite a few of these, and I'm sure they used some of the technology from this. Now, the Americans would say they took the technology from the Grand. The Russians would say they took the technology from them. This is what the Germans used as their first semi-automatic that went into full production. So this is either the G43 or the K43. The designs, it actually was first designed by Walther, so it was a Walther product, but then there were several other makers that used it. I already mentioned the G41. Here's a picture of the G41. It's a little bit awkward looking, and again, it was designed by Walther, but it was only used, well, it was produced very limited numbers, and it was rejected by the military because it did not perform well. And so really the first semi-automatic that went into full production, I was stumbling on those words, but basically they mass-produced these, several different makers, and issued them to the Army was in 1943. And generally up until this time, all the soldiers were issued a bolt-action K98. Now this also came in a sniper version, but generally, just like in the United States, if you had a sniper who was really accurate and from distances, they preferred the bolt-action sniper rifle, just like we preferred the bolt-action sniper. I'm told that they're more accurate at distance, and so a rifle like this would probably be the one, I think it's Enemy at the Gate, where they had a Russian sniper versus a German sniper. And I think the end of the movie is the Russian sniper wins. But they were using bolt-action rifles with high-powered scopes. The Germans were very good with their optics, which is why they were famous for not only scopes, but cameras and lenses and things like that. So here, coming back to the K43 or G43, semi-automatic, again, pull the bolt back, it locks back. When you put in the round, it'll come forward, and then I believe this is a 10-shot magazine. So in order to make my point about the development of the rifle, that most of the war they were using this. You can see the production quality. It's got the high polish finish. This is from 1935, by the way. It has the high polish finish, but again, you're only shooting one bullet at a time. This is considered a G date for 1935. K98. It's a lot to remember, but when you're playing Call of Duty, instead of grabbing one of these, if you get the chance, you want to grab one of these. So this then becomes their semi-automatic rifle. Both of these use an 8mm cartridge. The U.S., of course, was using either 30 caliber or 30-06. In the case of the machine gun, they were using pistol rounds. So we know that the U.S. was using a 45 caliber pistol round, and Germany, this is an ironic thing that I wanted to point out, and I almost forgot. So this is actually really cool to think about. Instead of going from the bolt action to the semi-automatic that I just showed you, they actually skipped a step. Again, if you watch war movies, you know the MP40 with the folding stock. They actually, before that, had an MP38. So Germany actually went from bolt action to a fully auto submachine gun that they gave out. And again, it's pray and spray. You see a lot of times they're not real accurate. They don't really aim them. It's just for close combat use. But the MP38, the MP40, you know, they had those produced in the very beginning of the war. So either you were issued one of these, or if you were an officer and had a choice, you would pick up an MP40. And it wasn't until 1943 that they had a comparable semi-automatic rifle that was accurate at a distance. So in terms of new rifle development, remember we said there was really no improvements in pistols by and large from the beginning of the war to the end of the war. But in terms of rifles, the ultimate improvement was found in the German army and the development of the Sturmgewehr, also known as the MP43, also known as the MP44. So developed first in 1943. It was considered the first assault rifle because it used a cross between a rifle round, a full rifle round, and a smaller 9mm round, and actually it used an 8mm short. So it was lighter, you would have more rounds in the magazine, and it could be used as single fire or full auto, as opposed to the MP40, which was full auto, the grease gun, the Thompson, the Sten, all full auto. This way you had select fire, and that was the first one ever designed in 1943. They are obviously very popular with collectors, but also very expensive. We have sold them in a full auto configuration, but also we've sold several recently. I did a video where I showed I had 4 at one time, and we had them in semi-auto as well. And just to accent the point that at the end of the war, the OSS was sent to the different factories, so the Mauser factory, the Walter factory, the Steyr factory, the OSS, or their predecessor to the CIA, sent into these factories looking for experimental weapons. This is one of the ones, the VG-1-5. This was an experimental weapon that was picked up by the OSS at the end of the war out of the Walter factory. They never went into full production, although probably a few went out the door. There's no proof marks. It does have a serial number, and it is pressed sheet metal. It is bolt action, very crude bolt action here, very crude sights. This unscrews just like the grease gun, so you can unscrew the barrel. That's similar to the grease gun. This magazine is actually a Sturmgewehr magazine, and this is made in semi-automatic. You can see how crudely it's made. This is the safety feature, which does say safe and fire, but it is semi-automatic. Again, just pressed sheet metal, very inexpensive. I love this cloth sling, by the way. I'm sure it's correct to the gun. And notice the crude nature of the welding here, where they welded the barrel and the receiver, and then the wood parts, and the rest is just stamped metal. And I believe the serial number is right here. There is no other markings on the gun, no proof marks. This is marked MP44, so we know that's an MP44 mag. And again, never really was issued, just an experimental gun found at the end of the war. And I'm sure the U.S. manufacturers learned all they could from Walther and Mauser and Steyr and all the other makers in Germany. But this one made its way back to the United States, and I'm still trying to figure it out. I've never have shot it, but I think, once again, let's get Randy to shoot this thing. Okay, that concludes our series on development of pistols and rifles from the beginning of the war to the end of the war. Again, a real broad brush, but I think it's just a very basic education on some of the weapons that were used. I know I missed a lot, and some of you are going to write to me and say, why didn't you include this? I missed Japanese rifles. They would be interesting because they really, the development of the Japanese rifles went downhill toward the end of the war. It would be fun to see. So thanks for watching. I hope you learned something. Make sure you like and subscribe to our channel because I have a lot more I want to show you.